And now I have the honor to present our keynote speaker, Jacob Mundy. Hello, thank you for being with us. Jacob is a distinguished scholar working on the Western Sahara conflict for many years now. He's an associate professor of peace and conflict studies and Middle Eastern and Islamic studies at Colgate University. Together with Stephen Zunes, he published probably what is currently the most important and comprehensive book on the conflict, entitled Western Sahara, War, Nationalism, and Conflict Irresolution. I'm sure most scholars, just like myself, rely on his publications in their work. And as a starting point for the discussions today, Jacob kindly will give us an overview of the events that were leading up to the current situation. Thank you, Jacob, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Judith, for coordinating and organizing and helping organize this event. I'm quite honored to be given this gift of a keynote address. I feel, especially among some of my colleagues here, I still feel very much the junior scholar in the room, even though I've been following this issue since the year 2000. So it's now over 20 years for me, and many decades for Sahrawis who have been dispossessed of their country. The focus of my remarks today will be mainly on the ceasefire, the collapse. I've been asked to present on the end of the ceasefire agreements and its consequences. My comments today are partially in relation to a report that I'm working on with the European Council on Foreign Relations that will be published in the coming weeks. This report is based upon original research that we've been conducting in recent months, me along with my co-author. What I will be talking about today will be the main points in terms of the lessons learned about the failure of the UN peace process in Western Sahara and what we could possibly look forward to, both in terms of the good and the bad. So how did Western Sahara get to this point where we have seen now a collapse of the ceasefire? Not only is Polisario having resumed armed struggle, the first time since 1991, but now Morocco is also changing facts on the ground in terms of where the berms are, particularly around the flashpoints of Guerguerat. And Morocco has recently conducted an airstrike that killed a senior Polisario commander. So the situation is very serious indeed. With a situation like this, there are obviously dangers and opportunities that need to be considered. And so I would like to talk about both of those. Now, how did we get here in terms of the UN peace process? The points that I would like to identify very quickly are: one, the original settlement plan, which was solidified in the 1997 Houston agreements negotiated by James Baker, was abandoned by the Security Council and the Secretary General in the year 2000. Before the threats of a referendum on independence could be used to leverage a more reasonable agreement from Morocco, the Security Council and the Secretary opted to abandon the work that had been put into it. This is important precisely because, one, the reasons for the abandonment are entirely ridiculous in hindsight. One of the key points that the Secretary General raised was that it could be 2 years before there would even be a referendum. And here we are over 2 decades later. The other point that is interesting is that Security Council raised the prospect that one of the sides, i.e. Morocco, might not respect the outcome of the referendum. So it is clear that the referendum was a very important piece of leverage in the hands of the personal envoy, James Baker, in the hands of the Secretary General, in the hands of the Security Council, that was abandoned. That leverage was given away. Making matters worse, Morocco was encouraged by the United States and others to abandon King Hassan II's commitment, right? This was encouragement given to the new regime of Mohammed VI to abandon Morocco's commitment to a referendum on decolonization as the solution, something that Hassan had provisionally agreed to in the early 1980s, albeit for complicated political reasons. And instead, Morocco was encouraged to adopt an integration-only approach, one that is clearly in violation of international law, based upon Moroccan notions of autonomy. And so in so doing, the key members of the Security Council effectively encouraged Morocco to view annexation as the only approach that needed to be taken to the Western Sahara issue. To make matters even more worse still, after Baker resigned in 2004, the UN Security Council abandoned the entire idea that its job was to develop a UN peace plan. And the shift here was towards a plan that the parties themselves would adopt under the rubric of mutually agreed. Now, the problem with mutually agreed is it hands the parties veto power. And of course, handing Morocco veto power over the peace process was a huge blow to any progress that could be made, particularly because mutually agreed now gives Morocco the power to define what self-determination could mean in the context of Western Sahara. So this was a catastrophically disastrous move by the Security Council in terms of abandoning its responsibilities to Western Sahara. And this shifted the role of the personal envoy from negotiator who would be responsible for developing a plan. Remember, Baker's role was first to solidify and get the parties' agreement to the 1991 settlement plan vis-a-vis the Houston agreements. Two, in the later iterations, the Baker plans, most notably the 2003 peace plan for the people of Western Sahara that Polisario and Algeria accepted and Morocco rejected. And there is also an important moment where the UN Security Council refused to push forward with what was at that point in time probably the best possible way forward for Western Sahara given the political realities. And those political realities have changed. So we need to discuss what those new realities are. The office of the personal envoy, in effect, has become a facilitator of non-existent dialogue. The first of these, Peter Van Walsum, wasn't even intended to be a personal envoy. His appointment as personal envoy was in response to Algeria's unwillingness to accept him as anything but a personal envoy. So the Secretary General simply upgraded his title. And that's how Peter Van Walsum became the first of a series of these personal envoys with a new mission to facilitate dialogue. Basically a mission impossible given the mutually agreed criterion. Making matters even worse still, these members of the Security Council, including the Security Council itself through resolutions, have supported Morocco's 2007 autonomy proposal, which Morocco has taken as endorsement. And that we've seen that Morocco's negotiation position since 2007 is that autonomy is a take it or leave it offer. In the King's 2015 speech marking the commemoration of the Green March, King Mohammed VI said that the autonomy proposal is the most Morocco can offer. And I would suggest that Morocco has felt very emboldened to adopt this hardline take it or leave it position, which is an integrationist position, because of the encouragement that it has received under the late Bush administration, the Obama administration, and then now the Trump administration has obviously blown things up in very important ways that we can discuss. But Morocco has been allowed to construe support for endorsement, and that has been hugely detrimental to the Western Sahara peace process. More importantly, the UN Security Council has refused to really empower the personal envoy. We saw how Morocco systematically undermined the work of Christopher Ross for 7 years. And we saw how Morocco's increasingly obstructionist behavior vis-a-vis host Kohler was also obstructed and not penalized by the Security Council. So what are the dangers in this current moment where the ceasefire has collapsed? Well, I think we all realize that the military situation could easily spiral out of control. Polisario is now conducting armed attacks on a daily basis, including bombardments, missile attacks, and commando raids, including in southern Morocco. Morocco has changed facts on the ground, including the berms that are in southern Morocco to fend off these attacks against Polisario, but more importantly, in the UN ceasefire buffer zone near Guerguerat, which is perhaps the most egregious change in the status quo we've seen since 1991. Morocco has also shifting, we've seen recently, from a policy of denying that there's anything happening in Western Sahara to one of denunciation of Polisario attacks, and now engaging in what appears to be counterattacks against Polisario. Polisario could and probably will have to escalate this situation given the non-response from the Security Council, the weak response from the Security Council, the utter absence, the missing in action nature of the UN mission, the ceasefire monitors, who are not monitoring anything as far as we can tell, and that the Polisario will have to shift from a tactical use of armed force to encourage the peace process to a strategic use of armed force to achieve independence through military means. Now, what could escalation lead to? Well, I think here is where we enter the realm of nightmares that could become true. Non-state armed third-party actors, such as the Islamic State, could see an advantageous situation in Western Sahara, which would bring about a Mali-like crisis in the region. The prospect of a Mali-like crisis is one that Algeria would be could not ignore. Algeria would not be able to accept this kind of instability in its southwest, and it could trigger Algerian intervention. And let us recall that under international law, Algerian intervention on the basis of humanitarianism has much more grounding than Morocco's claim to Western Sahara in terms of its irredentist assertions. Here I cite the precedent of India's intervention into East Pakistan, Bangladesh in the 1970s. Now, what are the opportunities? The opportunities, I think, are also very clear. We can rethink the Western Sahara peace process. And I think this is long since overdue, given the fact that there has been no progress, there has been no substantial talks between Morocco and Polisario since the early 2000s. In fact, there hasn't been any, one could argue, substantive dialogue since the Houston agreements of 1997. So what can we do? Well, one, what is very interesting about this moment is that the UN Security Council can no longer fetishize the ceasefire as the primary reason for MINURSO's existence. The ceasefire is broken, MINURSO is powerless and impotent to do anything about it. And so the UN Security Council can get back to the business of actually facilitating a solution to this conflict. The mutually agreed standard must be abandoned because it has been used as a bludgeon, as a veto power by Morocco to get out of making any compromises, even less engaging in substantive dialogue. The standard of mutual compromise should be imposed. Now, if it seems that this is too much of a realist, pragmatic standard, let us remember what Polisario has compromised. Polisario has already compromised its right to independence in terms independence outright, right? That was the key compromise that was made in the 1991 settlement plan, the 1997 Houston agreements. Polisario compromised its right to independence. Remember, Western Sahara has a right to independence, not just self-determination, but if you look at UN General Assembly resolutions from the late 1960s and early 1970s, Western Sahara has a right to independence. That has already been compromised, right? So we need to take that into account when we adopt a new standard of mutual compromise. There's also a chance to deprioritize direct negotiations. This has been the key objective of the personal envoys. Direct negotiations need to be used only at a later stage in the peace process. Remember that the 1991 settlement plan was negotiated entirely through indirect means. Much of Baker's later work leading to the second Baker plan was negotiated indirectly. So direct negotiations are not necessary for there to be an agreement, especially when we shift back to a UN plan. So we move away from a plan developed by the parties to a UN plan. The personal envoy should not be the only person in the room. We need to decenter the role of the personal envoy, stop putting the burden, the entire burden on the personal envoy's shoulder, and perhaps even engage the friends, Spain, Great Britain, France, the USA, and Russia more directly in the negotiations, possibly through their envoys, maybe even using the current Iran negotiations as a model. So by returning to a peace process based upon the development of a UN plan, which had guided the UN successfully from 1985 through 2003, in returning to that, right, we can explore other options between integration. And remember, autonomy is a solution based upon integration. It is not a solution between integration and independence. And there are models that we can look to, including models that do satisfy Western Sahara's right of self-determination, that are based upon free association or confederation, which are outlined in, for example, Polisario's 2007 post-referendum agreements, which have been utterly ignored by the international community, but do offer very substantive ideas about how a relationship could be forged between Western Sahara and Morocco that guarantees satisfaction of various interests while respecting Western Sahara's right to independent statehood should they choose it. And remember, the ultimate backstop to all of this is that the people of Western Sahara have the final say. And no one is ever saying that they shouldn't, but we need to rethink how we approach the peace process, because since 2005, the peace process has been utterly a disaster and has only set back Western Sahara to where we were in the late 1980s. So on that point, I will conclude, and now we can proceed to the panels.
Thank you very much, Jacob, for this very insightful presentation. And then I will hand over to Manfred, who will be the chair